Thanks for joining me again, Laura. Last time we
No
spoke
worries.
about discovery calls and we talked about the role of AI, and we got quite a lot of traction around those. What I wanted to chat to you today about is something which because of the changes around non-DOMs and the introduction of the FIG regime, obviously statutory residence test and UK resident status is now really important. No, inheritance tax, how long you're in the UK, all those things are suddenly really, really important for anybody who has an international presence, whether they're visiting or whatever. It's always been important, but it's kind of gone up a notch. So I just wanted to talk to you about that and the statutory residence test, how it kind of like what it is, how people use it, the limitations of trying to do it yourself, but also the kind of questions that people should be asking about their situation so that when they come to you, they're prepared with the information that you need to determine tax resident status. So what is the statutory residence test?
So the statutory residence test is the way that we in the UK determine UK tax residence, and it came into play in April 2013. I think when it was introduced, the idea was it was to make things a bit more clear cut and ideally a bit more simple. But the reality is, because of the number of rules that HMRC introduced in terms of the statutory residence test, it effectively made it a little bit more complicated for people. There are various ways by which you can be considered either resident or non-resident in the UK, and it's very easy for people to maybe focus on one aspect of it and go, oh, well, based on this aspect, I'm going to be non-resident. You go, but have you thought about this other particular element? And yes, so there's various tripwires and pitfalls and things that can help to trip you up basically as you go.
So yeah, I mean, ultimately, you've said that they brought it in to try and simplify the process. With I don't know every single country's tax regime or how they determine resident status, but as far as I'm aware, we're the only one with a flowchart that kind of looks at this kind of thing. And obviously, if you search online, there's flowcharts all over the place. We've created one. We have one on our website, as well as an explanation.
I have my version as well.
Just sitting conveniently beside you. So, like, why is it so important to know your tax resident status?
Well, I suppose the starting point, if you are UK tax resident, is you're taxable in the UK on your worldwide income and gains. If you're a UK tax non-resident, subject to various anti-avoidance rules, etc. But the starting point is generally that you're considered taxable only on your UK sources of income and realistically only on gains in relation to UK land and property. So that's I suppose there's various reasons why it's of relevance and use for people. And you mentioned with the abolition of the non-dom regime and the introduction of the foreign income gains regime, and how actually understanding your UK tax residence position for 10 years prior to your arrival in the UK plays a really big part. But also, I mean, I don't know whether you've seen it, but we've certainly seen a massive uplift in people contacting us about leaving the UK for tax reasons, which I would say probably up until maybe about 12, 18 months ago, if people were looking at leaving the UK, it would be because they were looking at leaving for personal reasons. There was, tax was almost a secondary consideration. Whereas, say at the moment, there seems to be a real trend towards I want to move for tax reasons, but actually I'd like to spend as much time as I can in the UK. And at that stage, I think tax residence planning and statutory residence test plays a really important factor.
So we've seen similar. So yes, there is definitely a shift in people's questions around like where they want to go. So we get quite a lot of questions about moving to, say, Cyprus, Malta, or the UAE, where people actually come to us and say, well, can you help us? Can you guide us? Which are the best tax jurisdictions to go? And obviously, from a perspective where you have tax responsibilities, you shouldn't necessarily move for financial reasons. You should move for lifestyle reasons. So that's kind of our view. Obviously, that's not everyone's view, and that's not what everyone wants to hear. And they will always compare different countries. And obviously, understanding the tax regimes is important. So my understanding, and please correct me, essentially it's down to an individual's responsibility to tell HMRC what their tax residence status is based on the Statutory Residence Test. It's not HMRC saying, looking at your situation going, right, we're going to run through this with you. You actually have to declare your tax residence status.
Yes. So assuming you have to file tax returns, then the obligation falls on you. It's self-assessment. So you would look at your residence position, go, yeah, okay, based on the statutory residence test, I am UK tax resident or I'm a UK tax non-resident. And then if you are non-resident or if you've got foreign income and gains regime or under the suppose existing rules under this year's tax returns that are being prepared. If you wanted to claim the remittance basis, for example, you then need to make sure that you are completing the residence and remittance basis pages. If you are leaving the UK and effectively breaking residence with no ongoing sources of income, and you don't have any need to file a tax return in the year that you're leaving the UK, under normal circumstances, you can just report to HMRC using a form P85 to tell them that you're leaving the UK. But again, the onus then falls on you to monitor what's going on with your residence position. Yes, you might tell HMRC that you're leaving the UK and you're breaking UK tax residence based upon your expectations. But the whole thing about the statutory residence test is it's in the large part, it's very black and white, and it's very much about what actually happened rather than what did you intend to happen. Um, I'm sure at some point we might talk about double tax treaties, and at that stage you have a lot more importance upon what is your intention. At the time, was your intention to be out of the UK for a longer period of time or a shorter period of time? But when it comes to the statutory residence test, how many midnights did you spend? What were you doing in the UK? And once you've done that, you can't then undo it.
So, yeah, so you mentioned midnight. So who checks this? Once you've actually put your residence test in, you've determined what you are, and then you've told HMRC, who actually then checks that actually what you've said is correct?
Well, I mean, I suppose that depends. So fundamentally, the starting point is its self-assessment. So you submit your tax return advising that this is the amount of midnights that I've spent in the UK. I'm non-resident. These are the number of ties I've got to the UK. I meet the criteria of full-time work outside of the UK, etc., etc. So you'd fill it in to say this is why I believe I'm non-resident. So suppose unless your tax return is enquired into, potentially nobody checks it. But my understanding is from the small number of enquiries that I've seen in relation to analysis of the statutory residence test, if you are pulled for an inquiry, HMRC will investigate with a significant amount of thoroughness, in terms of they will want evidence of your travel calendar, potentially kind of your boarding cards, your passport stamps, things that prove that you have actually been traveling when you say you've been traveling, or in and out of the UK when you say you have. If you are trying to prove that you were working full-time outside of the UK, they will ask you how long you have been working, to make sure that you have worked your average of at least 35 hours per week. Um, and they will not accept, well, my contracted hours are 40 hours a week, and why on earth would my employer let me continue if I wasn't doing at least 40 hours a week? That's not considered to be acceptable in terms of proof. So they would want to see some sort of timesheet, some sort of evidence, I suppose, if you're self-employed, if you were invoicing a client, to be able, in an ideal world, if you could invoice them and say, well, I've done this many hours per week, and that's why I've invoiced them, like to be able to demonstrate that that you have done that work. In terms of the days of physical presence, my understanding is that HMRC possibly do have access to border control, so can actually pull some of the information themselves to be able to kind of double check what you are saying, but they won't have access to everything. But I suppose it's one of those that where as soon as HMRC asks you for evidence, the emphasis is very much upon you to be able to provide that evidence. And if you can't provide it, then expect a big old fight about what your residence position is.
So it's from what you're saying, if I was an international person and I was traveling to and from the UK and it was in my interest to not be tax resident in the UK, what kind of stuff? My take would be that actually I'm going to make sure that I've got the evidence. So what kind of evidence would
Yes.
be a really good idea to just, presumably when it's cut and dry, whether you are or aren't, you kind of don't have to worry about it too much. But when
Yeah.
you're actually planning your tax residency, what kind of information, what kind of evidence would be advisable to either keep or look out for or make sure is available just in case?
So I would say it depends what kind of test you are considering yourself as being non-resident for. So, for example, if you are looking at full-time work outside of the UK, and you can say search it, like in the HMRC manual, there is a section that says these are the things that we would be looking for evidence to prove that. But records of your work done. And in an ideal world, evidence that it's a real-time record. They get a bit funny if it looks like you're manipulating data after the matter,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to prove something to them. Because whereas if you're working for an employer and they are willing to let you just pull your timesheet, then great. But equally, there are a lot of people, and a lot of our clients work for technology companies where potentially pulling records off their system is not going to be considered to be ideal.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose potentially getting evidence from, if you are an employee, evidence from your employer, details, certainly details of any records of your travels. There are, say, various apps. I'm sure we work with a firm called Daisium who offer kind of a day counting software that tracks your location on a real-time basis. As you go through kind of to countries, as long as your phone's on your person, it will track where you are. But not only that, you can then use your phone and take pictures and, oh, look here, not only was my phone in that location, but so was I. And in particular, because in some instances, um, I've had a few instances this year where we've had people who have left the UK, but maybe they were students beforehand, so they were leaving the UK and breaking residence by means of ceasing to have a home in the UK. So in that particular instance, we were their home was effectively their parents' home before they left the UK, and we were like, okay, but if you are breaking residence by not having a home and you're coming back to the UK, where are you going to be going during, like, when you're back in the UK? Because if you go back to your parents' home, you kind of starting to have a bit of an issue. Like, do you still have your home in the UK? At which point, actually having something on your phone that says, I was in the UK, but I was in a total different postcode to my parents' home for the duration. So I couldn't, I definitely didn't stay there at my former home. So yes, if you are as well, when it comes to like the sufficient ties test, you've got various things. Looking at work days. So a work day from HMRC's perspective is where you work on at least 3 hours per day. So if you are doing any, obviously keeping a track of what days you're working and not working, but in an ideal world, if there's any sort of evidence, and I don't know whether you can necessarily collate evidence that you haven't been working, how to prove the negative, but for example, I don't know, you went to Alton Towers instead of working one day, keeping your tickets to Alton Towers to prove that, well, I was struggling to see how while I was on Nemesis I was working, for example, could be quite useful. And similarly, an accommodation tie is something that can trip people up. If you stay with family members, well, if you're staying in Airbnbs, keep your records of your Airbnbs that you've been staying in. Again, it's a bit hard to prove a negative, but if you've got evidence that you're staying in an Airbnb, why would you do that if you were also staying at family members' homes?
Okay. So all of this kind of makes sense. We do get asked those kind of questions. During COVID, people got stuck in various
Mm.
countries, right? Lots of people
Yes.
got stuck in the UK because suddenly, overnight, planes shut down. Is there any kind of situation where I didn't like I've triggered UK residency because external factors meant that I had to be in the UK? Like I planned
Yeah.
everything carefully, and then a family member got taken ill and I had to stay, or the
Yeah.
planes got shut down and I couldn't leave, or maybe Heathrow's power went out for some
Yeah.
reason or other. Are there kind of like caveats around that side of things?
So there are, but actually they are really, really limited. You can claim exceptional circumstances in certain instances. And actually, COVID was one of the best examples where HMRC pretty much universally acknowledged that if you were in the UK when that first lockdown happened, was it 23rd of March or something, 2020, it was pretty much acknowledged that at that stage nobody was travelling anywhere, and yeah, okay, you got stuck. But the exceptional circumstances days, and even during COVID, it was limited to 60 days. Um, you also have to go careful in terms of sticking around because um, of family members, or potentially travelling to the UK because of family members being ill. So I've seen some people where when they've been doing their tax return and they said, "Oh yes, no, I've got exceptional circumstances that had to come to the UK for a funeral." Or from HMRC's perspective, that is not considered to be exceptional circumstances. Life and death is something that happens. Now, if, for example, you were saying skiing in the UK, I'm not sure where exactly in the UK, but you
Milton
you know you
Keynes.
broke. Okay, we'll go with Milton Keynes. You were skiing in Milton Keynes. You broke your leg. You ended up in traction or whatever in a hospital, and you were still in hospital when you should have left the UK. That in principle would be considered exceptional circumstances. The thing you have to go careful in terms of exceptional circumstances though, and it being allowable, is that you have to leave as soon as it's kind of physically sensible to be able to do so. So say for example you were in hospital for 2 weeks and then the doctor advised that you shouldn't travel for another week, then on the face of it, assuming it happened on the day you should have left, you'd get 3 weeks worth of exceptional circumstances. um, but say the doctor said you could fly after the end of that third week, and you then chose to spend another 2 weeks in the UK, at the point when the exceptional circumstance no longer kind of arose, or at the point in your intention to stay beyond the exceptional circumstances period happened, that's when when HMRC would go, no, the clock's starting again. There are certainly other things as well, just to kind of go careful with in terms of exceptional circumstances. Whilst you can still claim it, it won't necessarily work in terms of full-time work outside of the UK. So if you're having a significant break from full-time work outside of the UK, then you have to go really, really careful if you get stuck in the UK for exceptional circumstances. I suppose if you're in traction in hospital, likelihood is you're going to end up having some sort of sick leave, and the significant break period you kind of get a bit longer. But say, for example, it was a family member, a dependent child or something, that you were staying in the UK to look after. That's the sort of instances where if you're physically able to work and you're carrying on working, that potentially could cause you some challenges.
So this all sounds a bit more complex than I actually gave it credit for. So I obviously, having worked with expats and UK tax for so many years, you understand how complex these things are. One thing that we're seeing a lot more of is people coming to us, and we touched on it last time, about how people like to do it themselves.
Yeah.
Now,
Yes.
I think it's essential for me at this point in time in 2025, in summer 2025, to talk about AI. I think it goes with the territory these days. When people are doing their own research, when people are looking into this themselves, obviously they can technically tell HMRC their tax resident status. How risky is it to go, do you know what? I don't need to pay someone to do this. I'm going to crack on, do it myself and determine it. What kind of like implications are there potentially for that?
So I suppose the risk is that you get it wrong. I know a lot of people, when I maybe speak to them for the first time and you talk to them and they say, like, well, I think with the sufficient ties test, I've got 90 days, or I've looked at it and I'm thinking I'm going to be non-resident by means of the full-time work outside of the UK, but actually I'm going to stay in the UK until start of June, because that means I'll have less than 90 days, and they've missed out this significant break point. So they're not going to meet full-time work outside of the UK. They're going to then have to look at split year treatment based upon maybe leaving the UK and starting full-time work outside of the UK. It doesn't necessarily always impact on people, but the way they would think. But I suppose you do make a it's 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 risky. It is risky. And one of the things that I would say, especially because as I say, we're getting more and more queries about people looking to leave and take advantage of tax opportunities, let's say,
Mhm.
that are very much contacting us to make sure that they understand the UK tax residence position and making sure they understand at what point they become considered to be non-resident and what the tax implications of that would be. I think back in the days, so I would say probably around COVID and Brexit, we were getting a lot of queries of people who were maybe moving to Europe because they didn't want Brexit to happen, so they wanted to get into Europe before that was too late. Or alternatively, during COVID, people had the ability, like, because fundamentally, as a result of COVID, everybody had to be able to mobilise their workforce. So all of a sudden it was, oh, well, this is it. If this is the end of days, I want to go back to my home and be with my family. But oh, look, I can still carry on with my job. So people were relocating for very much for personal reasons, to countries maybe like Germany, or Spain, where actually, unless you're in special tax regimes, the tax rates are the same, if not higher than the UK. So there was less of an emphasis maybe put on the residence position, if that makes sense. Whereas nowadays, I think a lot of people are cottoning on to the fact that actually, so you can have it all, but you can go and live in certain countries where there's a sun, she says, looking out at the rain that's currently outside my window, and sun, a bit of a beach, and I mean you live near to the beach, but so it's a bit of sun, bit of beach, and you can do your work from wherever and pay less taxes, and a lot of people are kind of going for that at the moment. So supposed to summarize in terms of what you originally asked. um, um,
It's the risks, really, isn't it? It's the
I,
risk of doing it yourself.
yeah, and I was going to say, I think it's one of those where we quite often will speak to people who go, I think this is my residence position, and I would say maybe 5 times out of 10 they're not right. so
Okay.
so so I suppose long and short of it is, I personally would speak to somebody who's comfortable with the statutory residence test and is willing to spend the time going through it in a lot of detail, so you understand. Because again, from it's all well and good saying, okay, I'm going to be non-resident by means of the sufficient ties test because I'm going to have X number of ties and I'll spend X number of days in the UK as a maximum. But what happens if you end up tripping yourself up on one of the other tests that comes in beforehand? And that's where I think the real risk is for those who are doing it themselves comes in.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Laura. Once
No
again,
worries.
absolute pleasure. I'm sure this is a topic that's going to come up. I want to talk about split year treatment. It's something that fascinates me. The fact that you can get,
Yeah.
we're already in a confusing tax year situation whereby I was looking into why it is the 6th of April and the historic reasons behind that. But yeah,
Yeah.
then you chuck in split year treatment as well, and it's like, yeah. So maybe next time we'll touch on split year treatment.